This is the Sports and Society podcast, where we go beyond scores, statistics, and personalities to focus on issues and controversies in sports worlds. Your hosts, Jay Coakley and Jeff Montes de Oca, are sports sociologists and the authors of the book, Sports and Society, Issues and Controversies. The episodes in this podcast give you a behind-the-scenes look at the textbook with stories from our lives as scholars and athletes, as well as providing analysis of ongoing issues and controversies in contemporary sport worlds. We welcome hearing your thoughts and analysis, so please use this space to engage with us about the textbook or any of the topics we cover in this podcast. Hello and welcome to the 9th episode of the Sports and Society podcast. In this episode, we're going to be discussing Chapter 8, Race and Ethnicity. Are they important to sports? Are they important in sports? Your hosts, once again, are the incomparable Jay Coakley and me, Jeff Montes de Oca. Good morning, Jay.
Hey, good morning, Jeff. Good to be with you.
Yep. Every time, it's a great time.
Right.
All right, so let's get started. First, I want to preface today's episode by recognizing how the so-called racial reckoning that occurred in the summer of 2020 following the police murder of unarmed citizen George Floyd in Minneapolis led to profound changes in sports worlds. We're going to discuss the protests against state and vigilante violence in the Black communities and the protests' impact on sports when we get to Chapter 13 on sports and politics. But hopefully this episode will help prepare people who struggle to understand those episodes, those protests for when we get to that discussion. All right, so like the last episode when we discussed sex, gender, and sexuality in sport, this episode focuses on a concept that is central to how bodies are organized in society. As we will see, sports helps to make the organization of bodies seem natural and inevitable. But under closer analysis, we also see that, in fact, race is a social construction. So, Jay, why don't we start there with the argument that race is a social construction? And I'll be honest with you, when I first heard that as a college student, I kind of found it hard to believe. I mean, it was like, when I look back on, I'm surprised how surprised I was when I heard that, in a class that this argument that race is a social construction, because we always think about race so strictly in biological terms. But as we point out, there's more genetic variation within races than between races. So can you talk about how racial ideology leads so many people to see tremendous differences between races and attribute it to biology or essential and fixed differences?
Yeah, I grew up in the generation before you, and that whole notion of biology being the key factor in racial classification was even more prominent in my life than it probably was in yours. Even though it was prominent for both of us. And then I started teaching race and ethnicity in 1968. And so that's when I came across a lot of the literature that talks about the concept of race and the fact that it is a social construction. And my PhD dissertation was on Black Catholic priests and their self-identification priorities. Did they identify primarily with their racial heritage, or did they identify primarily with their vocational heritage? And that's when I really got concrete evidence that race was a social construction, because a lot of the things that I grew up with were being contradicted in every conversation that I had with a Black Catholic priest. And so basically, though, the concept of race is a way of categorizing people based on their physical appearance and their ancestry. And we don't people haven't done that scientifically. it, they've done it in a social context for political reasons, and they have used race then as a biological justification for everything from personal mistreatment to enslavement of Africans in particular, to forms of segregation and discrimination. So race has become a tool for justifying differential treatment of different categories of people.
One of the things I think about with this that's always been useful for me to understand for understanding race is we look at visible phenotypical characteristics, skin tone, hair, facial features, things of that nature, things that we can see on the outside of the body, and then we link those to assumed characteristics that we can't see within the body. And so one pattern of phenotypical characteristics gets associated with positive qualities, and another pattern of phenotypical characteristics gets associated with negative qualities. And then we organize those bodies hierarchically. And we're really creating moral hierarchies here between bodies. And then that justifies, as you said, like who can be colonized, who can be slaughtered, who can be raped, whose homes can be burned, whose homes can be destroyed, and who can be displaced, as we see going on in the world right now, right? And so this very simple idea of how we categorize bodies, this social construction, has really profound material impacts in the world that we live in. So let's link this now to the discussion we have in that box, the Focus on Sports box, where we talk about the search for a jumping gene. You know, how does this racial ideology then lead people to search for these essential characteristics in the body that the ideology assumes?
Yeah. And just to key off of your comments just now, the concept of race is relatively new, and it was developed in the 18th and 19th century, when the idea of internal factors influencing people's behavior, character, moral traits, and so on. So the whole notion of a genetic basis for racial differences is relatively new. People throughout history made distinctions between people from different cultures, and some people were defined by the Greeks and Romans as barbarians, for example, but that was a little bit different. They were grouping into categories, but they didn't tie it to some innate, inherent biological trait like a gene. So with American racism in particular, and with Black people becoming involved in certain kinds of sports, basketball being one, there were attempts to link a particular gene with the particular abilities that were perceived being possessed by the Black athletes. And so white people wondered why white people couldn't jump, and they wondered why Black people could, and they ascribed it to race. And they connected it with special genes that they imagined exist. Now, I can tell you that there's dozens of genes that are connected with jumping, and those genes all interact with each other, and that interaction is influenced by the cultural environment within which people live. So we're talking about something that's very complex here, jumping. But But the jumping gene was something that a lot of white people thought existed in my generation. And and I grew up playing basketball. So, by the way, I went to college between 1962 and 1966 and played at a good basketball team that played basically a Division I schedule, and and we played against black players who were dunking during games. Now, I grew up in Chicago. I practiced dunking for years, and so I was into dunking. But when I graduated, they passed a rule in the NCAA outlawing dunking. And it was because of Lou Alcindor, later Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, uh, who was dunking at UCLA as a 7-footer. And white people in the NCAA didn't want black people taking over this particular sport. So they banned dunking. And they banned it for 10 years. So, I graduated before that happened, so I had my chance to dunk, uh, but the black athletes and white athletes for that 10-year period in the late 60s and early 70s couldn't dunk. And that was a race-based decision tied to this notion that blacks had a genetic jumping ability.
I have a good story with it to go with this. So, I'm 5'11", and my sons are just a little bit shorter than me. But my younger son, when he started high school, got on the volleyball team, the boys volleyball team, and played on his first year he made varsity, and played till they killed the boys volleyball team. But so when he was going out for volleyball, he wanted to be able to jump up over the net and block shots and hit kills and things like that. And so we did research on how to improve your jumping.
Mm-hmm.
And we developed a whole well, we didn't develop it, but we followed workouts that other people developed. We built one of those boxes. I forget what you call them. They're jumping up on with one foot, and
they use that in CrossFit now.
Yeah, right. In CrossFit, lots of things use it. And so we did strength exercises, we did coordination exercises, because a jump is a very complicated movement that uses your entire body, and there are more effective and less effective ways. And so we added inches onto his vertical jump by spending a summer training together doing jumping. The assumption that it is a gene within the body that's just a God-given gift that you don't have to train for, that says you don't have the discipline. It assumes that some people, and in this case, black people, don't have the discipline and work ethic to train at things, which is really discriminatory, stigmatizing, and it's rooted in much older racial beliefs and racial ideologies. And there's this whole colonial history to what we're talking about here. You talk about, race being defined by biology as something really recent. And in fact, the concept of race has been around for a very long time, but it was defined very differently historically. And so you hear, when you look at old texts, they'll talk about the race of the Franks, the race of the Lombards. Well, who were the Franks and Lombards? These were Germanic tribes, right, that settled in different parts of Europe, France, the Franks, Italy, the Lombards. Jews were considered a race, right? All of these, and we'll talk about this later, ethnic groups were considered races in the past. Well, then you move into the modern period, specifically with global colonization. Now Europeans are coming into contact with people that they had never come into contact before, and they can see visible differences, and they're trying to make sense of the differences between the people and use that distinction to legitimate colonial conquest, and they draw upon the knowledge systems of their times, specifically quasi-scientific knowledge of the body. And that's where this biological understanding of race comes from. It's rooted in this colonial history. And what's important to to the argument you're making about that sort of the 19th century race science or quasi race science is that um, in the 19th century, this scientific racism said that white people are both physically and mentally superior to all other people. And the proof of that was white people had colonized 3/4 of the Earth's surface by the turn of the 20th century. Well, then in 1905, Jack Johnson, the black heavyweight fighter, chased Tommy Burns down, caught up with him in Australia, and finally had a match with him and beat him. And when Tommy Burns hit the canvas in 1905, I'm pretty sure is the year, um, one of the key legs of white supremacy also hit the canvas. Jack Johnson demonstrated that white people are not inherently physically superior to black people. And there were race riots all over the United States. And films of the Jack Johnson Tommy Burns fight were banned because they were triggering race riots. And then all of a sudden, we have to explain, why is it that why is it that black athletes can outcompete white athletes? And then they have this unfair genetic advantage. It's not that they work hard. It's not that they train harder. It's not that they're more passionate about these sports. All the characteristics that are assigned to the white athlete, no, it's just their body. They have this genetic advantage. God gave it to them. They didn't earn it. And yeah, so okay, let's move on before I don't want to keep going. We could go on and on there, but let's move to a different point. One of the things what I want to do now, Jay, is let's distinguish race from ethnicity, because so often in casual conversation, people will use race and ethnicity almost interchangeably, or they'll use the term ethnicity when they really mean race. Sometimes it's because they want to be polite and not invoke a term that's so emotionally charged, particularly in the United States. But sometimes they just don't know the difference. So help us understand the distinction between race and ethnicity.
Yeah, well, race is basically tied to the belief that some categories of people, some populations, are naturally or biologically distinct from others, and that that biological and natural distinction is tied to genes. It's tied to uh, conclusions about the humanity of people, how civilized they are, and so on. But it's a biological basis. And ethnicity is different than that. It refers to a population that has a unique cultural heritage, and people people in that population identify with that history and culture of their ancestors. And so this is not a biological definition. It's a cultural, anthropological, and social definition. And that's a big difference, because people see that as being more changeable in certain ways than any kind of biological characteristic, and they see it as more uh, uh, as something that can be expressed in different ways than some of the biological traits that are ascribed to people in racial categories.
What do you think about some of the different ways that race might get talked, not race, excuse me, ethnicity gets talked about in sporting spaces. And I'm thinking in particular the way in which, say, national character might get invoked, and stereotypes about national character and how that gets linked with ethnicity.
Yeah. Now, ethnicity is certainly tied to uh, the ideas that people have about people in other nations, and looking at nations as a population group. But when you watch global soccer, for example, global football, and listen to the announcers, and I've done this in other countries, and one of the things you find is that these national stereotypes, which are basically ethnic stereotypes in a way, uh, get infused into the interpretations that the announcers give to what's going on the field. So the Brazilians, for example, are flamboyant and they're rhythmic, and there's this focus on movement and the body, whereas the Germans are intelligent, work ethic. They've done planning, they've got a good strategy. And so it's intellectual kinds of factors. So what we find in connection with some uh, uh, incorporation of ethnicity and national character into sport, we find things very similar to what goes on with race and racial stereotypes related to the abilities of athletes. And whites play with their heads, blacks play with their bodies. And that's an oversimplification of a very complex set of stereotypes that explain why there's white quarterbacks and why black quarterbacks didn't break into that position at the college or professional level until relatively recently, and how blacks were wide receivers, they were cornerbacks and halfbacks who needed, in quotes, good instincts and speed in order to excel at their positions.
So you shifted to a discussion on racial stacking or positional segregation. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit more on those ideas, because once again, I think the idea of racial stacking or positional segregation really illustrates how ideas about bodies then they become real in institutions like sport, and then that has profound implications for other aspects of life. So yeah, could you just elaborate a little bit more on this idea of racial stacking?
Yeah, well, racial stacking means that uh, athletes from different racial groups are seen as being especially skilled in certain positions because of their biological abilities, biologically based abilities. And in football, that meant that a quarterback who had to be the team leader had to use his brain in order to be successful. Those positions were assigned to white athletes, and the positions that required speed and quick reaction times and an ability to take a hit, those positions were assigned to black athletes. And the same went in basketball. The first time we had racially mixed basketball teams, the team leader, the guard that called the plays, was always a white person, and the power forward that needed all of these physical skills in order to play that position was generally the black athlete. And you even when I was growing up, I saw teams with four black athletes and one white, and the white was the leader, the guard on the team that called the plays. And uh, by the way, one of the reasons I picked the school that I did when I had various scholarship offers was it was racially mixed. And having grown up in Chicago, I felt comfortable in that kind of a situation. And our coach was really good at handling a racially mixed team. So uh, he later got a job at Kentucky and won the national championship because of that ability. So, so I learned in that kind of a context, and he didn't ascribe to the same stereotypes that others did. And what happened was that made our team better because he was using people on the basis of their displayed skills rather than any kind of stereotypes that he had about what positions they should be playing.
That is such a great point. I really want to just underline what you said, Jay, because what we're seeing here is when we talk about racial stacking or positional segregation, right? We could begin with, say, coaches whose ideas are influenced by dominant racial ideology, so they look at people and categorize their bodies. So a white athlete, if it's football, is more likely to be put on offense and in a central position. A black athlete is more likely to be put on defense and an outside position. Um, and so then those ideas are made real because then you spend your life, right, growing up, training in these different positions, and you become really good at those positions. And maybe you make it all the way to the highest levels of the professional sports. And people are watching that. And their ideas about race, the racial ideology, is reproduced in the world that they're looking at.
Yeah.
And then they're like, need to make decisions, right? I need to hire somebody. I need a manager. You're not necessarily like racist. You're not necessarily, as we use, I should put that in scare quotes, right? As we use that term to be racist, like intentionally discriminatory or hateful or something like that. It just seems natural that the white man is the person that should be in charge. And it just seems natural that the black person, whether man or woman, should not be in charge, or the white woman should not be in charge. And so then again, our ideas are being reproduced in the world that we live in. And now we're experiencing that world, and it seems natural and it seems inevitable. And so what we're talking about here is what in sociology we'll call is a dialectical relationship, where one thing is in dialogue or correspondence with another, and they influence each other, and it becomes a feedback loop. And those things are very hard. They can be very hard to break.
Definitely. That's why blacks didn't become coaches, even though they knew the game inside out and backwards for a long time. And there was always disproportionately fewer black coaches than there should have been in both the college and the professional levels across sports. And it's why only recently did we have two starting black quarterbacks on the Super Bowl teams. So, these things, like you say, are really difficult to change. They get built or baked right into our culture to the point where people don't even think about them anymore. They just act consistently with them.
Thank you for bringing up coaches and how difficult it is to hire black coaches at the highest levels. Not because there aren't tons of qualified black coaches out there, but because they don't get hired.
Right.
Because it's a nice segue to my next question, and I want to connect this discussion we're having about racial ideology to a racial scandal that happened a couple of years ago in professionalized sports. In 2021, John Gruden was forced to resign as the head coach of the Las Vegas Raiders when old emails had surfaced in which he used racist, sexist, and homophobic language. He claims that he's not a racist, that he used poor choice of words to express his anger at his time. And for the sake of argument, let's take John Gruden at his word, right? We'll say he's not racist, although There is evidence to argue to the contrary, but we will take him at his word. So, how does this concept, racial ideology, help us to understand why a white man in a position of authority would resort to racial, gendered, and sexual language to express his individual emotional state?
Yeah, this is a great question because it relates to a lot of our personal experiences. And, when John Gruden said, wait a minute, I didn't mean that, I'm not racist, I tend to believe him in a sense. What he was doing is expressing something that it has just permeated our culture. Racism is like our cultural air. It seeps into our thoughts, into our words, into eh, all of our vocabulary, and into our actions without us making any conscious choices. So we're not consciously talking about uh, race in a negative way. It's hey, this is just part of the whole context within which I've lived my entire life, and that's what was happening with Gruden when he gets into an emotional situation. That culture that has become a part of him got expressed, and he was apologetic about it. And I'm sure that he had a hard time even explaining it to himself. And one of the things that I've noticed uh, over my life is that I grew up in that culture as well, and that racism seeped into the contexts within which I was living my life, and the only way that you can stop those comments or thoughts or words from being a part of your life is to become critically self-reflective and to develop your own knowledge about race and racism and race relations in your world. So you have to do that in order to control that that racial air that has seeped into your system. So, and that's a tough thing. And a lot of people either don't know how to do that work or they don't have the time to do it or the inclination. And so they will make comments like that, or they'll have thoughts. When somebody does something, immediately they make a racial interpretation of that particular event.
There's two concepts operating in our discussion here that I want to name them and I want to define them to make those clearer. And I think that will help at least some people understand what we're talking about a little bit better. And one of the things that we're doing here, both of us, we do this like almost naturally because we're sociologists and it's like seeped into our discipline, is a distinction between individual racism and institutional racism. Individual racism is the intentional actions and beliefs of specific individuals and groups. You hold stereotypical or prejudicial ideas and you act upon those. And there's an intention there. And what's important here it is for the most part, research finds, to a very large degree, white people, when they use the word racism, they mean individual racism. A person is racist if they intentionally were trying to cause harm. Institutional racism is different. Institutional racism says it really doesn't matter what the intentions of individuals are because racial inequalities are built right into the institutions of society. And that's because when these institutions were formed in the 18th and 19th century, racism was legal. It was a part of the legal structure. And so it becomes built right into the very institutions that we live in. And therefore, people can just live their lives follow the rules that were given by the institutions with no ill intent, but unequal racial outcomes will happen anyway, because that's just how the institution works. So when John Gruden says, "Hey, I've been in sports all my life. I've worked with, black, white, all different races. I I'm not racist. I'm not trying to hurt anybody." At that individual level, I think he's being honest. Now, there's other evidence to say, well, he might not be as honest as he's being, but we won't go into that, because that's a longer discussion. But what he's doing is he's drawing upon a racial common sense and using prejudicial, stereotypical, and stigmatizing terms to hurt other people. So, for instance, if you think being a woman is less than being a man, then you call a man a feminizing term. Or if you think that homosexual people are less than straight people, then you use a homophobic term to insult them and hurt them. And so then what you're doing is you are reproducing those hierarchies and those stigmas through the language that you use. You might not hate the women or gay people or black people, but you're still hurting them by using this stereotypical and stigmatizing language.
For sure. And in some cases, that language is learned before a child even understands the concepts from, that they're referring to, at 5 or 6 years old. And, the homophobic terms, when I was growing up, they were part of the vocabulary of little kids, straight and otherwise, and they were used as negative comments. But then as you got older, and if you had a gay friend and you still use those words, then you really caught yourself. And because you knew you were hurting somebody rather than just using a vocabulary.
That's such a good point, and it reminds me of something happened when one of my sons was a little kid. He was maybe 5, 6 years old. We were sitting, I think, in front of a cafe or something out on the street, and we see a black man running down the street. And little kid, right? My son, he's like 5, 6 years old, says, "I wonder what he did." And whoa, little dude, why would you even wonder, right? Why does that come into your head? We had to have a conversation about that, because, as you said, it's in the air we breathe. These ideas are in the air we breathe.
Yeah.
And one of the troubles with this idea of individual racism is it moralizes people's actions. Good people are not racist. Bad people are racist. Well, how many of us think of ourselves as bad people? How many of us really want to be immoral, right? And so then it becomes very difficult and emotionally charged to talk about these issues that you might consciously be anti-racist, but you have these ideas sedimented, right? And we all do. And I say you, I mean, I include myself in this. In fact, I had a student yesterday give a research presentation on internalized white supremacy within the Black community. She's a Black student studying Black people and how Black folks can reproduce racism, because again, it's baked into the culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what you've just summarized in a very good way is really relevant to probably 90% of the students who will listen to this, because they're in universities where critical race theory has been either discussed or critiqued or banned. and critical race theory is exactly what you've been explaining. It is theorizing how racism gets institutionalized, and when people talk about racism in an elementary school class, white students should understand those differences because, we're not talking about them or even their parents in many cases. We're talking about an institutionalized phenomenon here, and we're not blaming any individuals for the racism. We're talking about it being built into the system and how people have responsibilities to try to eliminate that. But so anyway, the whole debate around critical race theory, CRT, is related to a failure by many white legislators and administrators to make the distinction between individual racism and institutional racism.
Let's keep pushing on this thread a little bit more, Jay, because say with the John Gruden scandal, I find students react to it differently. Some are like, oh, it was just overblown and it's not a big deal. We see this happen all the time and it's not fair. And other people will say, this really is a big deal. And it speaks to a larger situation. And we could say the same thing with the debates around critical race theory, where some people find critical race theory very threatening, and other people find critical race theory very empowering. And that distinction I'm drawing between groups of people tends to break down along race, right?
Yeah.
And so can you talk a bit about how racial ideology impacts people differently? So it could impact a Black person differently from a white person, or a Black man differently from a white man, or even a Black woman.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I think that basically ideas about race are tied to physicality, sexuality, moral character, uh, and emotional expression, and other factors. And I think when racial ideology is applied by whites to blacks, it leads to a fear of black men because of the stereotypes associated with black men, certain kind of physicality, certain kind of moral character, a certain kind of approach to relationships, and all of those things come together. And in using racial ideology, it leads people to develop a fear of black men, and that has a major impact on their lives. And and it doesn't affect black women in quite the same way, although there are stereotypes that do affect black women, and the angry black woman, and the nanny stereotype, or the Aunt Jemima stereotype. All of those things have affected black women, but with black men, the fear being a result of their stereotypes, of the stereotypes, really affects how people interact with black men.
And and that's such a good point, because what you're talking about here are two things simultaneously. On the one hand, we talk about the racial ideologies. We have these frameworks of perception that guide us in how we interpret the world around us, make meaning of it, but then we act based on those interpretations. So we also have experiences of the world. And since the racial ideology is about distinguishing bodies, so we put different frameworks on different people, people then have different experiences. So the exact same incident could mean something very different to different people depending upon their race. Obviously, as we were talking about, their gender, their sexuality, their class, the region that they live in. There's all sorts of factors that because of our frameworks of perception and our experiences, that are going to then lead to like we understand this thing very, very differently. Some people say, oh, that's no big deal. It's no big deal to them. Other people say, oh, that is a big deal because it is a big deal to them because of their experience and their understandings.
Yeah, let me just give you a real quick example of that. In 1970, I started teaching for 2 years at Northern Arizona University, and they had a full athletic program, and they recruited Black athletes from the Phoenix and Tucson areas and around the country to play basketball, football, and track and field. And there were no Black faculty. And because I taught race and ethnicity, I was asked to be the faculty sponsor of the Black Student Union, which was comprised of 80% of the people there were Black athletes. And as I listened to those athletes talk, what I heard was their fears, their anger, their frustration, their sense of being outsiders, even though they were representing the university on these teams. And one of the examples that I'll give you that sparked those fears and anxieties is that Black women weren't being recruited because the women's sports program wasn't taken seriously. So there were no other Black women students. So the Black athletes dated white women. Well, the people who objected to that at the university found out where those white women lived, what their addresses were, and how to get a hold of their parents. And they sent their parents letters saying that their white daughters were dating a Black person. And then the white daughters got all sorts of heat from their parents. And remember, this is 1970. So the white students were experiencing, indirectly, that racism that just kind of permeated our culture. And and I tried to make that an example in my class to help white students see how racism can affect them as well as their Black peers. So that's something that still is around. And the Black athletes at predominantly white institutions right now are experiencing not the example I gave maybe, but similar kinds of examples in the form of microaggressions and other comments and other things, just the availability of activities on campus and so on that exclude them, don't take them seriously, or marginalize them.
One of the things that we've started touching on in the last couple of questions, but I want to make explicit, is intersectionality. Really, let's focus a bit more upon that, connecting, taking a more intersectional approach to the discussion of racial ideology. And what I'm thinking about is the example we have in another one of our focus on sports boxes, the example of when Caroline Wozniacki, during a match with Maria Sharapova, stuffed towels over her sports bra and into the back of her tennis skirt to create a caricature of Serena Williams. So, Jay, help us to understand how the exaggeration of secondary sexual characteristics, the breasts and butt in this case, made this placial act a racial performance that invokes colonial history and knowledge.
Yeah, it's she was mimicking her perception, cartoon-like perception of Serena Williams when she did that. And she exaggerated all of these characteristics, and she saw it as a playful act, kind of a racial performance. But she was invoking a colonial history in that caricature that she didn't know about. And Serena Williams maybe knew about it, but a lot of other people did. And that kind of exaggeration was tied to an example back in 1810, where British colonialists were in Africa and they were colonizing the Hottentot peoples. And one of the genetic characteristics of the Hottentot peoples, who had been a self-contained population group for a number of years, was that they retained fat cells in certain parts of their body, the breasts and the buttocks in particular. And in fact, their bodies were accentuated to a point where uh, a particular uh, colonist, a British colonist, saw this woman named Sari J. Bartman, a woman from the Hottentot group, and who had large breasts, so large buttocks, and he captured her in 1810, brought her back to Europe, and displayed her in exhibitions and at the World Fair and at freak shows. And it was a classic example of the racism that's tied to uh, colonization. But the irony here is that Bartman's body became a symbol eventually of idealized feminine sexuality, and it influenced fashions in 19th century England and Western Europe. Now, I want to just say that the anthropologist who worked with Bartman, when she died, he was able to obtain her body, and he removed her brain and cut off and dissected and examined her genitals in hopes of contributing to white knowledge about Black female bodies, brains, and sexuality. So this was obviously an inhuman act, uh, claimed to be science, but his findings didn't reveal anything, but the stereotypes that emerged around it actually influenced the fashions, and it even influenced Disney's animated films, where the characters wore dresses that accentuated their bust, their buttocks, and slimmed their waist. It became kind of a common look. And that was all tied to colonial history and the Sarije Bartman phenomena. So, and Caroline Wozniacki portrayed that on the tennis court, in public, in front of millions of viewers.
You know, and I think one of the things that's really important that you're getting at there, right, with this colonial history and knowledge, is that Sarah Bartman became a racial and sexual curiosity. White people's reaction in Europe, the United States, the reaction was filled with, well, curiosity, desire, fear, disgust, a whole range of complicated and conflicting emotions, because racial ideology and sexual ideology are also complicated and contradictory. Well, throughout her career, and the career of her sister Venus, right?
Right.
Serena, she faced that mixture of desire, curiosity, fear, discomfort, disgust, all of that swirled around. So even if people aren't familiar with the story of Sarah Bartman, even if people aren't like necessarily hateful, these same ideas circulate across time and they have profound impacts. And so both, you know, we celebrate Serena and Venus now because of their courage to integrate tennis, which was so white dominated at the time, but that was really hard on them. And
yeah, the comments,
them, right? It
yeah.
wasn't just them.
And it's no accident that they chose to accentuate fashion. You know, what they were doing was they wanted to portray and dress their bodies in the way that they had control over, rather than other people taking control of their bodies and making interpretations of them.
Very powerful expression of Black feminism.
Yeah,
Absolutely. Even if they don't articulate, a clear feminist line, they lived it. And I think that's
yeah.
that's really important. Well, we're running long on time as always, so we better move on. And I want to have a discussion about another one of our focus on sports boxes because it focuses on indigenous names and likeness for sports mascots and logos. And we argue in that section that's a form of identity theft or cultural appropriation. And this is oftentimes a very contentious claim since for a lot of people they have very deep emotional attachments to an indigenous mascot or logo, right? They grew up with that team. They grew up loving that team and the name or the mascot is it's a signifier, right? It symbolizes that team. And a lot of times they'll argue that the use of indigenous names and likeness is a means of honoring indigenous people. So then why then make the claims of identity theft and harm caused by the use of indigenous names and likeness?
Well, for in the first instance, what teams have done is they've taken name, image, and likeness from a particular indigenous group, or maybe a generalized sense of indigenous groups, and they've used them uh, in their own way. And in the process, they have, uh, in a sense, disrespected the culture from which they've drawn this image and likeness. And they've sometimes even disrespected some of the uh, cultural practices associated with those groups, like the tomahawk chop being a classic example, or certain kinds of chants that are being mimicked when those chants are part of religious ceremonies of the indigenous people. So to say that you're honoring somebody when you're taking parts of their religious rituals and parts of their identities and heritage that you don't own and using them for your purposes, it's very difficult to say that you're honoring someone in the process. And I'm just for the students who are listening to this, if you're talking about NIL, name, image, and likeness, in connection with college sports, we're talking about something that is in a way similar because college athletes have had their names, images, and likenesses used by others for the benefit of those others, the financial benefit of those others, and they've never been compensated. And they've never been asked if their images and likenesses can be used. So, so now NIL is giving them the right to profit off the sale of their name, image, and likeness. And I think that if we want to make a quick transfer over to the teams that have used name, images, and likenesses of indigenous groups, those teams owe those indigenous groups a big debt because they've been using for their profit for years, for decades, uh, something they didn't have permission to use. And the other example I'll use, coming from my Catholic background, is if a team was called the pastors or the missionaries or something that referred to the Catholic clergy, and their mascot was a priest dressed up in robes and wielding a rosary that the mascot would twirl around his head and lasso an image from the other team and saying that they're lassoing the sinners from the opposition, and then go over and use the sign of the cross to bless that sinner and provide that sinner with salvation. Catholics would go wild. And they would say that that is defamation of a religion, defamation of Catholic beliefs, defamation of Catholics themselves. But when Native people, indigenous people, say that that's a defamation of our cultures, our religion, and of us as individuals, people don't take it seriously. So, you know, this is something that we have to take the role of the other in order to understand. And we have some examples in our own lives through which we can do that.
Thank you, Jay. So we are running very long, not yet, but we're gonna run long on time here, and we have two questions. So I think we only have time. We should only, in fairness, address one of these questions. The one question I lean towards the Tiger Woods question, would you rather do the globalization question? Which one would you prefer?
Well, Tiger Woods is still playing. I think we ought to talk about that. And we'll talk about the other issue when we talk about politics in sport.
Fantastic. Good strategy. Okay. So and the reason I lean towards this question is because in the United States in particular, we tend to talk about race in a very black-white binary. And for the most part, you and I, Jay, we've been doing that in this episode, with the exception of the mascots and logo point that we just made. And so let's try to trouble that binary a bit. And let's use the famous golfer Tiger Woods to further problematize the binary way in which race so often gets conceived. I mean, I guess my question is, how does Tiger Woods help us to problematize that binary way of thinking and talking about race?
Right. And anybody who's familiar with Tiger Woods knows that he's been identified as a black golfer. And that identification doesn't take into account the fact that Tiger Woods is only 1/4 African American, and his mother, for example, there's a photo in that chapter of him with his mom and dad. His mother is 1/2 Thai and 1/2 Chinese, and his father, Earl, who died a few years ago, was 1/2 African American, 1/4 Native American, and 1/4 Caucasian. But Tiger Woods is labeled as black. And that's a legacy of what we have called the one-drop rule in American history. And the one-drop rule refers to how racial classifications were made in terms of a binary in American history, where if a person had one black ancestor that could be traced, they were defined as black. If you had one drop of black blood, so to speak, then you were black. And that binary distinction was done to preserve the so-called purity of the white race and the power of white supremacy. And they didn't want mixing of the races because that would mess up the notion of white purity and white supremacy. So the binary got built right into the conception of race so that there was no mixing. And it's only been in the last so many years that we've even acknowledged within American culture that racial mixing has a major impact on people's identities, on how they conceptualize their heritage, on the relatives they have and interact with, and so on. So the binary was always a false distinction.
I want to bring in another aspect to this, pull another little string with Tiger Woods. And this is really my comments are really guided by research that my good friend Stan Thagaraj did. And this will come back. We may bring this up again when we get to the chapter on sports and religion as well. So one of the things that Stan points out in his research is that blackness was really central to the marketing of Tiger Woods when he first went into professional golf. And it was very consistent with the time period that he represented, this sort of like post-racial integration of golf, and that a black athlete could be very successful in a historically white country club sport. And that led to a lot of endorsements for him. Then Tiger had a sexual scandal. It was humiliating. The long story short is he had numerous affairs with working class white women, and cheated on his upper middle class white wife. And that was this like fall from grace moment. And then Tiger, because he was losing, must have been millions of dollars in sponsorships,
It was.
there was a real rehabilitation of his image. And so where his father was really important in the buildup, in the rehabilitation, his mother becomes really important. And he comes out as a Buddhist because of his Asian mother, and says he got away from the values of his religion, and that he's going to, reaffirm the values of Buddhism. And so then we see this shift away from Tiger Woods being characterized as this black athlete to an Asian athlete, and invoking model minority stereotypes. And so there is this really powerful way in which race, religion, gender, and sexuality are all articulating together in this moment. And through sponsorship, they're given a dollar value. And this was really successful for Tiger's rehabilitation, in terms of like the media image, and therefore the sponsor, the marketing value of him as an athlete. And so again, this older idea of this like sort of binary that we tend to have just breaks down in so many different ways. And we're running out of time here. We need to sign off, and we haven't even talked about Latinx athletes, and there's so much that we're just not even going to get to in this episode. But we better stop right here. So let me just say, in our next episode, we're going to continue to explicitly focus on social relations of power, as we have in this episode and the previous one, because we're going to discuss Chapter 9, Social Class, Do Money and Power Matter in Sports? And the short answer is yes.
And by the way, that's a really irrelevant one right now. And I don't see it becoming less and less relevant in the future, given the way politics and culture is going right now. So we will have a good time talking about that, and it should be interesting for our listeners.
I think so. All right, Jay, thanks so much.
Okay, Jeff, take care. See you next week.